Hi everybody and welcome back. We're in week 4 of our online learning and this is social studies, our social studies lesson for this week. So this week we are continuing with our Civil War unit. We first talked about Texas in the Civil War, then we learned about Abraham Lincoln last week, and this week we're going to move on to the period after the Civil War known as the Reconstruction era. So, our social studies joke of the day. The Southern United States calls the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression. Fort Sumter. Am I a joke to you? It's funny because Fort Sumter was, if you were paying attention previous weeks, Fort Sumter is where the first shots were fired, and it was fired on by Southern soldiers. Which is why it's funny because technically the South started the war. So, do now write 2 to 3 things you can recall about Abraham Lincoln and his impact on United States history. You can pause the video, but I'm going to keep going. Okay, so our job today, our TEK is the same TEK we've been working with, 4.4a. The student understands the political, economic, and social changes in Texas during the last half of the 19th century. The student is expected to describe the impact of the Civil War and Reconstruction on Texas. So our objective, the learner will identify three impacts of the Reconstruction on Texas. So we're going to identify 3 impacts of the Reconstruction on Texas. So after the Civil War, a lot of work needed to be done in the South. Many soldiers had died. Cities, forts, farms, and homes had been destroyed. The South also needed to build a new society and economy that did not have enslaved workers. This time of rebuilding and change was called Reconstruction. So, 2 years before the Civil War ended, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which, as we know, freed all the enslaved people in the Confederacy. After the war, the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery throughout the United States. On June 19, 1865, General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas with an important message. All enslaved Texans were free under the United States law. Granger rode through Texas bringing everyone the news. 1 year later, June 19, 1866, African Americans celebrated the anniversary of this great news. This holiday is known as Juneteenth, and it is a state celebration of the day slaves in Texas learned that they were free. So, rebuilding Texas. Reconstruction was a difficult time. Across the South, everyone had to learn to solve problems in new ways. Few Civil War battles were fought in Texas, so the state had little in property damage. Still, the state's economy had suffered. Texas had to rebuild businesses, and both landowners and newly freed African Americans, had to learn new ways of life. Ending slavery changed the South politically, socially, and economically. To help with these changes, the federal government created the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau helped African Americans in many different ways. The Bureau gave them food and clothes. It helped them find work and places to live. It helped both African Americans and white landowners adjust to the new economy. The Freedmen's Bureau also helped African Americans with education. Under slavery, most African Americans were not allowed to go to school. So, the Bureau started more than 1,000 schools and colleges in the South. In Texas, the Bureau opened about 150 schools for African American adults and children. Reconstruction impacted Texas in many ways. For example, it was during this time that African Americans had began to go to school. For African Americans who had been slaves, these were exciting but sometimes confusing times. Former slave owners told them that they were now free. African Americans could come and go as they pleased. According to the law, they could control their lives, but now they faced new challenges. Where could they find jobs? What land could they farm? So, the result is that many African Americans became sharecroppers. A sharecropper is a farmer who pays part of what he or she grows to a landowner. So here's how it worked. A landowner rented land that they owned to a farmer. The landowner also loaned the farmer tools and seeds, etc. The farmer then paid the landowner a share of the crops. But if the crops were bad, sharecroppers could end up in debt. So, finally, Texas rejoins the United States. Reconstruction meant rebuilding states politically, too. Once the Civil War was over, the 11 Confederate states had to rejoin the United States. First, each state had to write a new constitution and create a new state government. A constitutional convention met in 1868 in Austin. 10 of its 90 delegates were African Americans. They were the first African Americans elected to public office in Texas. By 1869, those delegates had written a new constitution for the state. The first governor was Edmund Davis. The new constitution gave the right to vote to adult males, including African American men. African American men also gained the right to hold office, and many African American leaders helped to set up the new government. One African American leader, Matthew Gaines, was elected to the Texas Senate in 1869. The new legislature had to vote on new amendments to the United States Constitution. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments ended slavery and protected the rights for former slaves and all African Americans. Finally, on March 30th, 1870, Texas rejoined the United States. Once again, the United States flag flew over Texas. Now, looking at after the Reconstruction, accepting the new laws was hard for many people in the South. By the 1870s, talk grew loud and talk grew angry. Many white people wanted to undo the changes made during Reconstruction. Some white Texans joined groups to frighten African Americans so that they would not try to hold office. One of these groups was the Ku Klux Klan. Klan members hurt and sometimes killed African Americans. They wanted to stop them from voting. Southern states set up a system of segregation. Segregation is racial separation, or keeping African Americans separate from white people. Jim Crow laws were laws that enforced segregation. These laws kept African Americans and Mexican Americans in separate schools and prevented them from having certain jobs. Some Jim Crow laws made it difficult to made it difficult for African Americans to vote. When Texas rejoined the United States, more than 250,000 African Americans lived in the state. They gained rights, like the right to vote, during Reconstruction. In the years after Reconstruction, they lost many of those rights. They were treated unfairly well into the 1900s and even till today. The struggle for equality would end up being long and difficult. But after the Civil War, African Americans had the most important right of all, their freedom. So, our three big impacts of the Reconstruction on Texas. African Americans began to vote, go to school, and take office. Texas wrote a new constitution, as did all states in the Confederacy, and the rise of the system of the segregation in the South known as Jim Crow laws. So, African Americans began to go to school, vote, and take office. Texas wrote a new constitution, and the rise of Jim Crow laws, which enforced segregation. So, let's review. Our job today was to identify the three impacts of Reconstruction on Texas, which are: Texas wrote a new constitution, the rise of Jim Crow laws in the South, and African Americans began to vote, take office, and go to school for the first time. Now, your MOL is Google Forms. It's graded. Make sure that you complete this and make sure that you are able to submit it. Now, your assignment is in Achieve, and it'll be under Social Studies, and the lesson is Civil War and the Reconstruction, Home Sweet Home. You have 7 vocabulary words: benefit, dispute, inhabit, nomadic, official, relocate, and require. Make sure you take a look at the before reading poll. You're going to talk about if keeping family traditions is more important than fitting into a new culture. If you agree, you disagree, why or why not? You must complete your stop and jots, the after reading poll, and the math activity. Optionally, you can complete stretch and thought question. Then for your extension activity, you are going to do a writing piece. And you're going to answer this prompt. Is Juneteenth an important holiday to celebrate? Why or why not? Write a brief paragraph, 4 to 5 complete sentences on your thoughts. Use complete sentences and correct spelling and punctuation, and then submit it into Google Classroom if you are able. Alright guys, awesome work today. So proud of you. Keep working hard. If you have questions, don't forget we have Zoom Q&A sessions every single day from 11:30 to 12:30. You can reach me by email, phone, or class tag. See you next time.